Hi, Jamie here. I really appreciate you taking a few minutes to watch this video. Today, I want to talk about the serious topic of domestic violence. More specifically, I want to discuss what happens when a restraining order is violated in New Jersey. Domestic violence impacts so many, and unfortunately, it is a cycle of abuse that doesn't always end just because a restraining order is entered. So it's important to understand as victims or people accused of domestic violence what impacts can happen when a restraining order is violated. First, some basics. A domestic violence restraining order is a binding court order that is intended to protect victims from future acts of domestic violence. Domestic violence can take on many different forms. It can be physical assault, harassment, stalking, terroristic threats, and others. No matter what the predicate act, domestic violence is serious and it's a cycle, often repeated by the same perpetrator over and over. And victims deserve protection that is afforded under the domestic violence statute. In New Jersey, there are two types of domestic violence restraining orders. There's a temporary restraining order, which is issued quickly, typically with little evidential requirement, and it's intended to be a temporary order. It's intended to only last for a short period of time and to really protect that victim in the early stages before any further evidence can be presented. Typically, when a temporary restraining order is issued by a judge, there are temporary restrictions barring the defendant in a domestic violence case from maybe returning to the home, maybe seeing the children. So that is why those temporary restraining orders are meant to be heard at a hearing fairly quickly because of those restrictive components in a TRO. The second type of restraining order in New Jersey is called a final restraining order, and it can have lifelong implications if it's issued against a person. So there's always going to be a hearing as to whether a final restraining order should be entered, which means that the temporary restraining order would be converted to a final one. Again, the only way to get out from under a restraining order is if the victim were to voluntarily dismiss it, or you file a certain type of application after the fact to say that the restrictions that are in the final restraining order are no longer needed. So a final restraining order is serious. So there has to be a hearing where evidence is presented and the burden that the plaintiff victim has to prove is much higher than that of a temporary restraining order. Whether there's a temporary restraining order or a final restraining order, those both can be violated by somebody if they knowingly take an action that is contrary to the restrictions in either of those restraining orders. So what does that mean? If there's a no contact provision, which all restraining orders have, and you as the defendant pick up the phone and call the victim of domestic violence, that would be considered a violation of the restraining order. And that has serious implications because it is a criminal contempt proceeding. Unlike a TRO or an FRO that are dealt with strictly in the family part, this then involves the prosecutor's office who can prosecute and does prosecute these types of offenses as criminal charges. The consequences for violating any type of restraining order in New Jersey are very serious. There are mandatory jail time requirements for second offenses. So you want to make sure if you find yourself on the other side of a restraining order that you are abiding by the provisions in that restraining order to a T. The prosecutor has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you knew what you were doing when you violated the restraining order. So it is a high burden for the prosecutor. But if there are multiple violations, that's going to be a serious issue for you. Sometimes I'm also asked the question, what happens if we reconcile? Can I still be found in violation of a restraining order? And the answer is yes. A victim of domestic violence has to voluntarily dismiss a restraining order in order for contempt charges not to occur if you're found in violation of that restraining order. It's sometimes confusing because you could be back living together. So how can you conceive that you've violated a restraining order? But the answer is that you can. So you want to make sure that in that instance, the restraining order is actually dismissed. And be clear that even when a restraining order is dismissed, that doesn't mean that the contempt charges that flow from any type of violation just go away. Because again, that's a criminal contempt proceeding and dealt with separately from the restraining order. Likewise, if you've been wrongly accused of domestic violence or violating a restraining order, we can help defend from the serious repercussions that will result if a contempt charge is issued. Please don't hesitate to pick up the phone and call our office and talk to one of the talented attorneys who are here to help you.